From the Toronto Star, I'm Adrian Cheung, and this matters. As protests in the streets against police violence, anti-Black, and anti-Indigenous racism continues, the conversation is evolving. The protests are a call to action. Protesters want tangible change from the people who govern our cities, our provinces, and our countries. In the span of 10 days, the idea of defunding the police went from one that activists championed but that few others were discussing in the mainstream to something that is actually beginning to happen in our biggest cities. The mayors of New York City and LA have made commitments to defund their police departments that have both had long histories of misconduct and race-based violence.
We will be moving funding from the NYPD to youth initiatives and social services. The details will be worked out in the budget process in the weeks ahead.
Minneapolis, where the murder of George Floyd ignited the mass protests, and its city council have passed an intent to disband the police entirely. The plan is to get rid of the whole thing and rebuild it with trained social workers, mental health professionals, and most crucially, unarmed officers that use de-escalation rather than weapons. Here's the president of the Minneapolis City Council.
Our commitment is to end our city's toxic relationship with the Minneapolis Police Department, to end policing as we know it, and to recreate systems of public safety that actually keep us safe.
The same question is being asked here. Should Toronto defund the police? The 2020 police budget in Toronto is $1.2 billion. It is the single biggest item on the city's entire operating budget. 90% of that money goes towards paying officer salaries. On your property taxes, that is the most expensive thing you pay for. Two Toronto City councillors are proposing to cut the police budget by 10% next year, the equivalent of $122 million. The bigger question by activists and allies, though, goes one step further. If people of color disproportionately die, face violence, or are injured at the hands of police, should the system of policing as we know it even exist? Today, we're talking to Desmond Cole. He is a journalist, activist, and author of The Skin We're In, A Year of Black Resistance and Power. We're going to talk about what it means to defund and abolish the police. We'll also talk about Toronto Police Chief Mark Saunders, who announced his resignation this week. Desmond, thanks for making the time to talk.
Thanks for having me, Adrian.
So first, let's talk about Toronto Police Chief Mark Saunders announcing his resignation. Your thoughts on his stepping down, his legacy? Do you think that this helps or hurts policing in the city?
Well, I think it's quite a time for Mark Saunders to be stepping down. Mark Saunders became chief right around the time that the Black Lives Matter movement started organizing in Toronto. And he stonewalled them for his entire term, tried to discredit Black activists for the entire term, didn't listen when they stopped the Pride Parade, didn't listen when Black Lives Matter Toronto camped outside of his police headquarters for 16 days after Andrew Loku was killed. Mark Saunders had a lot of opportunities to heed the warnings and the advice of the incredible activism that's been going on in the city during his term, and never chose to do that. And now that there is a huge resurgence thanks to the work of Black Lives Matter Toronto and many others before them and at the same time as them, there's this huge resurgence in Toronto where people are saying, we would like to do something about policing. And right when that happens, what does Mark Saunders do? He leaves. He takes the knee. He takes a knee at Yonge and College where Black Lives Matter Toronto stopped the parade 4 years ago. He doesn't acknowledge them. He doesn't acknowledge any of the people who have been pressuring him to do more for Black life during his term. He takes the knee for a photo op, probably because he knew he was about to resign. And that's how he wants us to remember him. And then he bounces. What can I say? I don't know his reasons, but the timing, I guess there was never going to be a good time. But I think legacy is always an interesting word because Mark Saunders' legacy will be his police pension. You know, Mark Saunders made $414,000 last year. We talk about his legacy like he's this like royal figure. This is ridiculous. Mark Saunders is a servant, a public servant, who served at the will of John Tory, who appointed him. And John Tory will appoint the next person as well. Mark Saunders as a person doesn't have a legacy to me. He's part of a paramilitary institution. If you want, his legacy, accusing the queer community of not helping the police find Bruce McArthur, covering up the fact that the SIU was not called after Michael Terrio allegedly assaulted Devontae Miller. His legacy would be not coming out of that police station for 16 days to talk to BLMTO or to say anything to the city after Andrew Loku was killed. And the person who killed him now, who we now know as Andrew Doyle, was not named and was not charged. This is Mark Saunders' legacy, if you want. But I mean, any police chief would have done all of the things that I just named that he did, because that's the police chief's job. The police chief's job is not to be here for us in the community, to protect and justify his institution of policing.
That he is the person leading this structure of policing in this city. That is his title. That is his job.
Yeah, and so what I think we pretend, though, is that he's also some visionary city leader who wanted to make things better for everyone. And that's absolutely nonsense. Like, people in our community got hurt, and Mark Saunders tried to cover for his police. That's it. We have to stop there and stop pretending that Mark Saunders took that role because he wanted to help the Black community. I will not miss him, and I don't care who replaces him, because I think we have bigger fish to fry.
Coming back to the idea of defunding police, even a month ago, I think that idea had fairly little traction at a mainstream level. I mean, you've written about it. And even this understanding of what the term is at a mainstream level is happening right now. What do you think are the most compelling arguments for defunding police, especially from how Black and racialized communities interact with police?
Well, the most compelling reason to defund the police is that they kill us. I don't actually need a better reason than that. And the fact that there have to be compelling reasons to stop violence actually really tells you, Adrian, where we are in the city and how far behind we are in our thinking and on our progress. Because certainly, I agree with the premise of the question. People would like Black folks to make the case to them. White people, particularly in this city, white leadership, would like Black people to make the case to them why our dying doesn't necessitate a different service, why we can't accept the amount of death, the amount of surveillance, the amounts of assaults in our community, assaults of our children, assaults of our elders, assaults of people who are walking home, even assaults of people who the police feel they want to arrest but just want to mess with. We are actually expected every day in Toronto to continue to suffer all that punishment and then give someone else a good reason why it should stop. This is the madness that we're living in. I'm not going to sit here and pepper you with the statistics. I wrote an entire book called The Skin We're In, A Year of Black Resistance and Power. So if people want statistical realities behind what police in Toronto and Canada do to Black folks, they can read that book. But I'm not here to plead for my life. If people think that, for example, several armed men sent by the government showing up to Regis Korchinski-Paquette's house and her ending up on the ground from a 24th story balcony.
The province's police watchdog is continuing its investigation into the death of a 29-year-old woman as questions continue to swirl around how she fell from the balcony of her High Park apartment.
If people think that that's something that I have to get over so that they can continue doing it, they need to rethink their priorities. We have forgotten what the police were even in name supposed to be doing, right? I don't believe the police do the job that we pretend that they do, but we pretend that they keep people safe. And then when someone is in crisis and the police go and that person dies, all the blame gets focused on the individual who is dead or who has been harmed by the police. We don't say, why did this intervention fail to keep people safe? We start justifying whatever the outcome was. That's what's wrong with the way that we view policing. And of course, when so much of the violence that the police engage in is disproportionately against poor people, people with mental health issues, Black people, Indigenous people, of course, the white patriarchal society that we live in is going to say, well, that was a one-off. That was an exception. Well, they should have listened. They should have complied. It's so funny how we say we're a different country from the United States, but all the excuses that I hear why the police can't stop being violent in that country, I hear in my own. So people have just given up to the idea that violent interventions, even into situations where someone's in crisis, are the only answer. And that the best we can do is pick up the pieces afterwards when someone is harmed or killed by our police. I do not believe that. I believe that what the city of Toronto needs is not police. The city of Toronto is the child poverty capital of Canada. And I fear that during COVID right now and in its aftermath, the job losses that we're seeing, it's going to get worse, Adrian. That's what I fear. But what's our city planning to do? Reinvest more in policing, not reinvest in childcare, not reinvest in school food programs for students, not reinvest in more public transit dollars. No, cut all those things and give more money to the police. And so we live in a city where it is more important to be policed than it is to eat.
Where it is the top line item in our multi-billion-dollar budget.
Right, and you have to add the next several services behind policing that we fund in order to get that $1 billion. So we've been very clear in the city of Toronto that the most important thing we can do is deploy men with weapons into our streets to compel people to do what they want by force. And that is our number one priority. And I don't play this game anymore, Adrian. If people think that that's how you build a great city, on fear and on forced compliance, they need to sit down and rethink their priorities. All the money that we are spending on policing could actually be going to support people in our communities. It could be going towards mental health interventions to support people before they have a crisis. But that same money could also send people with de-escalation training and supports to refer people, to take people to a clinic or a hospital if they would like to go voluntarily and not at the barrel of a gun or a taser. We could pay for all these interventions pre and post, but then we would have to defund the police, which people want to tell us is a crazy idea. But it's not unfathomable to them that people like Regis Korchinski-Paquette will continue to die and that they will continue to justify it. That's a realistic world for the average white person in this city. And that is what's wrong, is that they can easily imagine us continuing to die and them continuing to justify it, but they cannot imagine a world with fewer violent interventions and more supports. So Toronto has to get its priorities straight, and that begins with the person who's been cutting taxes for 5 years, Mayor John Tory.
Desmond, to you, what is the major difference? Is there a major difference between these two ideas of defunding and abolishing police? Is defunding a means of abolishing?
So this is a good question. Again, I would say before we talk about defunding, we have to ask ourselves, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? Again, the problem that many of us are trying to solve is that the police are killing us, and that if they're not killing us, their violence against us in our communities is causing unimaginable suffering, that you can't even measure violence when the police are doing it to us, because you can't measure a death. You can't bring someone back with money or with I'm sorry or with compensation even. But then all of the young people in our communities who are arrested and charged by police, all of us, hundreds of thousands of Black people who are in police databases and being surveilled for walking our own streets and being stopped and carted by the police. All of the people who have been subject to raids by the Toronto police officers, had their homes smashed, had their property smashed, had people in their homes traumatized, been subject to police violence during those raids. All this we pretend is normal, right? So we start from that point, and then when Black people say we don't deserve to be treated like this, folks say, well, okay, but what if we gave you 10% less raids, 10% less assaults, 10% less carding? That's what people say when they have the idea of defunding the police, but abolition is not their goal. If your goal is to defund the police so Black people will be quiet because you're a politician hello, Kristen Wong-Tam and Josh Matlow, they put forward this proposal. Let's reduce the police budget by 10%. Adrian, they came out with that proposal so fast, they didn't even have time to consult with anybody. And they didn't claim to consult with anybody. They answered a question that no one was asking. So let me ask this. If you defund the Toronto police force by 10% in next year's budget, are you planning to cut that 10% permanently? Well, the motion doesn't say permanently. It just says for next year's budget. So I presume that you can go back up after that if you'd like to. This is the shallowness of thinking and of intervening that our so-called progressive city councillors want us to accept. I don't want 10% less carding. I don't want 10% less people in our communities dying after the police go to their homes. I want that behavior to stop. So that means removing the means of police to be able to cause the overwhelming harm and death that they do. So it first means disarming the police. And then I believe it means disbanding that force and recreating it. Recreating a police force that A, has a different mandate than the police, but B, does not have the legal means to use lethal force on people while so-called helping them. We need a model in this province that you don't have the right to use lethal force when someone calls you to intervene in a situation. You don't. As a standard, you have the right to defend yourself. We all have the right to defend ourselves. But we've seen with Chantel Moore in New Brunswick that a police officer who could have simply backed away from her, claiming that she had a knife, decided to shoot and kill her.
On Thursday morning, Moore was shot and killed by a police officer in Edmundston, New Brunswick. She had just moved into a new place days ago, and a friend concerned about her safety called police, asking them to check up on her. But Mounties allege when the officer showed up at her door, she threatened him with a knife.
That officer knows that they probably won't be charged for shooting and killing a woman who they describe as dangerous. This is not care. This is not support. So the model has to change before we talk about how much funding it's going to get, because we don't want 10% less police shootings, 10% fewer, excuse me.
So any talk about, how people are wrestling with this idea of whether it's defunding, whether it's reform, you're saying none of those things really addresses the problem at hand here. It doesn't get rid of the structural problems.
No, and we're playing games because if somebody in a childcare center who worked there killed a child, probably the whole childcare center would be shut down. And we wouldn't be having do we, take away 10% of their staff? We just wouldn't accept that level of violence in a childcare center. If a teacher at a school killed one of their students, we have to think about why the police are allowed to do it and no one else is. If you presume that somebody is, let's say, think of the situations in our communities every day where we send the police. Someone's playing music too loud. Send 5 men with guns over to their house. I've had the police come to my house for a noise complaint. I'm like, what y'all doing with that Glock? What are you going to do with that? You came to my house to tell me to turn the music down. You need a Glock?
They come armed in a situation where there are mental health calls or reasons, like you just mentioned, that doesn't need the threat of violence.
DeAndre Campbell, the 26-year-old man who was shot and killed in Brampton in April by 2 Peel Regional police officers. He was shot in his own home after he called 911 for help.
26-year-old DeAndre Campbell was killed inside his Brampton home yesterday. The Special Investigations Unit says he was tased and shot dead by police.
The police had been to his house, his parents said, many times, and they should have known that they were dealing with a young man who had a history of mental health issues. Instead, they went in the house with their taser and their gun, and they used both of them in his own house against DeAndre and killed him. And his father said, why do you bring a gun to a mental health call? So that's what has to happen. That's the conversation we have to have first. And we have to expose the many people in our communities who say that they don't want the death, but still want to send the person with the gun to the mental health call or to the noise complaint or to the young man walking home in the street. If you can't agree with Black people that armed response is completely unacceptable in those situations, then we can't talk about defunding the police because you're just going to give us something token. In Minneapolis, where George Floyd was murdered, and where this resurgence of Black uprising took place. They are talking about disbanding the police force. You know why, Adrian? Because they know that that's what the people who are demonstrating are asking them for. And out here in Toronto, Kristen Wong-Tam and Josh Matlow are pretending that what we're asking for, since they never asked, is a 10% reduction in violence and carnage and suffering in our lives. And the worst part of it is that they are not aligned with Mayor John Tory on Toronto City Council. So their motion, in my view, has absolutely no chance of survival. But I do believe that in the very long tradition of so-called progressive city councillors in Toronto, they will offer this without having consulted with us. And then they will try for their own re-election purposes to come back to us and say, well, we tried. We were the ones that put forward that motion. Remember, we tried. And that's simply not good enough for us anymore.
What do you say to people, Desmond, who say, well, what about violent crime? What body should we have responding to those calls? You've talked about how we need to reshape even what police looks like and how we reuse these funds. What kind of body should be responding to those violent crime calls?
So I think that the issue with violent crime is that, A, the police are committing a lot of it. So again, if we're going to talk about violent crime, let's not pretend that the police are the ones presiding over that problem and not engaging in it themselves. Police officers beat people up after they're in handcuffs. Police officers beat people up because the person talks back to them. So if you're worried about violence, then why aren't you worried about that violence? That's the first question. But then the second thing is, people have this television version of violence where police are always running around with their guns drawn, pointing them at people who are about to do something and stopping those people from doing something by threatening them with force. That is not the real world. In the real world, if somebody breaks into a store, by the time the police get there, the person's gone. But now you've got 10 people on your street walking around in body armor and tasers with dogs and with guns. And we're paying for all of that response. But investigating who broke into the store doesn't require a gun. It doesn't require a license to kill. We can investigate robbery. We can investigate sexual assault. We can investigate any violent crime up to murder without running around pretending we're about to point a gun at somebody. It's not television. And if people themselves can't imagine doing those things without, again, a lethal force, I'll say it again. What are your priorities? And what do you think about the Black people who keep dying at the end of this violence? Look, you and I are journalists. We do investigations all the time. Now, sometimes media will be so proud of investigation that they will even say that it helped lead to a reduction in crime or into finding a criminal or into doing those kinds of things. So you can do an investigation without running around pointing a gun at people. But the whole running around pointing a gun at people is the legacy of things like the Northwestern Mounted Police in Canada. Police didn't always exist the way that they do today in this country. The Northwestern Mounted Police started to exist when they needed to push non-compliant Indigenous peoples off of the lands that the Crown was stealing from. That's the origin of policing. So of course our police are paranoid of Indigenous people rising up and pushing back against them. That's what they were designed to stop. Of course, our police, who were slave catchers as well for hundreds of years in this country, where white people were authorized to look at the lamppost and to look at the latest slave notice in Montreal. Oh, look, another one of them has run away. There's a $20 reward if you find him. Of course, white people in this country are feeling authorized to approach Black people with force because that's the history of policing in this country. So they just pretend that that's all normal. You can't really do anything and change it. But, maybe you can tinker a little bit around the edges. And they ignore all the violence and reproduced violence that those interventions and subsequent interventions like court and jail and the punishment side of things. People don't want to address how harmful and just perpetuating cycles of violence those things are doing. They want a different answer that doesn't allow us to challenge things up front. So I just don't believe in this mythology that says, literally, the subtext in Toronto is always gang violence, right? We always talk about gang violence. So I suppose that we're supposed to believe that if the police aren't running around armed, then the black angry gang men will take over the city. I mean, at least 30 years ago, the police chief in Toronto was willing to say things like that just out in the open. After the demonstrations for Lester Donaldson in the 80s when he was killed, the head of the police union said that the black people wanted to take over the city. And he was being honest. We're not honest anymore, that's what we're afraid of. And that's why all of this gang talk is used to keep reinforcing that we need the police. The police are the most well-funded and sophisticated gang in Canadian history. And if we're actually concerned about violence, we can start there. And all the money that they get that is not going into the impoverished communities where gang violence is an issue can go into those communities, and we can start to see some different kinds of opportunities and changes.
Desmond, just last question here. I don't mean to suggest that this moment is happening in a vacuum, that it's not informed by the history of protests before and all the work done before. But does this moment of mass protests in nearly every major city in North America, we're seeing it internationally, of, I think, a major re-examination of white supremacy, does this moment feel like everything is about to change?
No, it doesn't. The fact that we have to ask that question shows that it's not true. This is about white people making choices to defend their property and to feel secure from poor people and people of color. Adrian, we live in a city where during COVID-19, people who live in condominiums are calling the police and calling the city of Toronto on folks who are sleeping in homeless encampments in tents, sleeping in tents underneath a bridge, sleeping in tents in a park. And they're looking down from their heights at people who don't have what they have and still being like, someone needs to come clear them out of my view. That is the city that we live in. Are those people about to make a different choice? You see, we who advocate against this stuff, we're always asked to give hope. But I think that the people who are perpetrating violence against the homeless, who are perpetrating violence against Black and Indigenous and other racialized people and against people with mental health issues, against sex workers in this city, I think they should be asked if they're about to change. We shouldn't be asked if they're about to change because we're ready. But the people who feel protected by this violent state policing regime, they don't want to change. The pressure needs to be brought to bear on them. The rest of us are ready, but we don't have the influence that they do. We don't hold the power and influence of city council talking about how much property tax we pay because, yeah, they pay more property tax than I do. So I guess the unspoken wisdom is that they get to make more decisions than we do because they pay more. Well, that's exactly why the police exist. And that's exactly why during a pandemic, we're still seeing things like, I thought that there was no evictions allowed in Ontario, but I have twice gone to sites where people were about to be cleared out by the city and the police because they were outside sleeping in a place where the city and where the white upper class in this city doesn't want to even have to look at them. That's our priority, even when people are dying of a communicable disease. So don't ask me for hope. Don't ask me if this is a moment of change. Go to the person who calls the police on the homeless person sleeping and ask them if it's time for change. That's what needs to happen now.
Desmond, thank you so much for your time.
It's really a pleasure, Adrian. Thank you.
And that is Desmond Cole, journalist, author, and activist on the case to defund and abolish police. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Adrian Cheung, Saba Aitazaz, and Raju Muthar. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattinen, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star Newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.